Hey everyone, welcome back to Trek for Wealth, the podcast where we talk about money the way real people actually talk about money. I'm Avery.
And I'm Grant. And Avery, I want to mark a date with you today. April 2nd, 2025. 1 year ago, yesterday.
Liberation Day.
Liberation Day. The day President Trump stood in the White House Rose Garden and announced the most sweeping tariffs since the Great Depression. Nearly every country, rates from 10% to 50%. He called it, quote, the golden age of America.
And 1 year later, Americans are still waiting for that golden age, while paying, on average, $600 more per household this year because of those tariffs.
$600 per household in 2026 alone, from a policy sold as making America richer.
Today we are doing the full tariff story, what they are, why politicians keep reaching for them, what happened the last time America went this far down the tariff road, and it nearly broke the world economy, and what it means for your wallet right now.
This is one of those episodes where history is not just interesting, it's a warning.
Let's get into it. Grant, start with the basics, because I think a lot of people hear the word tariff and their eyes glaze over. Make it real.
So, a tariff is simply a tax on imported goods. When a foreign company ships a product into the United States, the U.S. government charges a fee, a percentage of the product's value, before it can be sold here. A 10% tariff on a $100 product means the importer pays $10 to the government before that product hits a store shelf.
And who actually pays that tax? Because there's a lot of debate about this.
There is a lot of political debate, and very little economic debate, because the research is remarkably consistent. Multiple independent studies, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Kiel Institute in Germany, all find essentially the same thing. U.S. companies and consumers absorb between 86 and 96% of all tariff costs. Foreign exporters absorb almost none of it.
So when the government says foreign countries are paying, they're largely not.
Largely not. Here's the mechanism. An American company imports a product from Vietnam. Vietnam's manufacturer charges the same price they always did. But now, the American importer has to pay the tariff on top of that. So the American importer has two choices: absorb the cost themselves, crushing their profit margin, or pass it on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. Most of the time, it gets passed on to you at the register.
So a tariff is effectively a tax on American consumers that's collected at the border and charged in the name of protecting American industry.
A tax on American consumers collected at the border. That is the honest economic description. And right now, the average U.S. tariff rate is near its highest level since World War II. The Tax Foundation estimates the average American household is paying $600 more in 2026 because of the current tariff levels. And the Joint Economic Committee in Congress calculated that since Trump returned to office, American families have already paid more than $1,700 in additional tariff costs.
$1,700. That's rent. That's a car payment. That's a semester of community college.
That's real money coming out of real household budgets, quietly, without a tax form or a bill.
Okay, let's go to the history, because you mentioned the Great Depression, and I want to understand what actually happened, because this story is genuinely alarming.
So it's 1929. Herbert Hoover has just been elected president. The economy is booming, roaring 20s in full swing. Hoover runs on a platform of protecting American farmers with higher tariffs. He wins. His party controls Congress. And then, October 1929, the stock market crashes. The Great Depression begins.
And what did Congress do in response?
They reached for tariffs. Two congressmen, Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon pushed a massive tariff bill. Raise duties on over 20,000 imported goods. Protect American industries from foreign competition. Get America back on its feet.
Sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? Now, here's what makes the story remarkable. Over 1,000 economists, more than 1,000, signed a petition begging Hoover not to sign the bill. They warned specifically that other countries would retaliate, that trade would collapse, that it would make the Depression worse. Hoover received protest notes from 23 trading partners before the bill even passed.
And he signed it anyway.
June 17, 1930. He signed it. And within months, the economists were proven exactly right. Canada, America's closest trading partner, immediately imposed retaliatory tariffs on 16 categories of American goods. Then France, Britain, Italy, Spain, Argentina, Australia. A cascade of retaliation from nations that depended on selling to America and now couldn't.
And what happened to trade?
World trade collapsed 65% between 1929 and 1934. 65%. U.S. exports fell from $7 billion to $2.5 billion. U.S. imports fell by 2/3. American farmers, the very people Smoot-Hawley was supposed to help, saw their export markets evaporate. Farm exports fell by 1/3 from their 1929 levels by 1933.
And unemployment?
8% when Hoover signed the bill, 16% the following year, 25% by 1932 and 1933. The tariffs didn't cause the Great Depression. That was already underway. But they deepened it, extended it. And some historians argue that the economic devastation they helped create contributed to the political conditions in Europe that brought Hitler to power.
That is a sobering sentence.
It is. And it's why economists have treated the name Smoot-Hawley as a watchword, a cautionary tale for 90 years. Reagan himself cited it in a 1986 radio address, calling it a trade war that helped sink our country into the Great Depression. Both parties quoted Smoot-Hawley as a reason not to raise tariffs for generations.
Until now.
Until now.
Okay, let's talk about what's actually happened since Liberation Day 1 year ago. Because it's not the Great Depression, but it's not the Golden Age either.
So the one-year picture is genuinely complicated, and I want to be fair to both sides of this. The immediate aftermath was dramatic. The S&P 500 lost more than $6 trillion in value in the 5 trading sessions after Liberation Day. It fell nearly 19% from its peak before Trump paused the highest rates in April of last year.
After the bond market got nervous.
Trump's own words, he said he saw the bond market getting queasy. The Treasury market wobbling is what spooked him into a 90-day pause, which tells you something important. The limit on tariff escalation is when bond markets panic, not when stock markets panic.
And then the Supreme Court stepped in.
February of this year, the Supreme Court ruled in Learning Resources v. Trump that the Liberation Day tariffs exceeded presidential authority under emergency powers law. The court said invoking a national emergency over a trade deficit was not a legitimate use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Around half of last year's tariff revenue will have to be refunded.
Half the revenue. Refunded.
Which Trump immediately addressed by reimposing a 10% tariff under a different legal statute for a temporary 5-month period. So the legal fight continues. The tariff whiplash continues. And American businesses, who need certainty to plan, to invest, to hire, are operating in conditions of extraordinary unpredictability.
And that unpredictability itself has a cost.
The uncertainty is the damage. JP Morgan has put recession odds as high as 60%, EY at 40%. The Congressional Budget Office says the tariffs will result in GDP that is, quote, lower than it otherwise would have been. Not a crash, a quiet, persistent drag. A tax that compounds quietly on every imported input in every supply chain in America.
The Buffett indicator, which measures market value relative to GDP, is above 200% right now. The CAPE ratio is at 39.8, second highest in 150 years of market history.
Which means we entered this tariff environment from a position of stretched valuations. There isn't a lot of cushion. If the tariff uncertainty tips into an actual recession, the historical average S&P decline during recessions is 31%.
And investors sitting at or near all-time highs with a 31% historical downside if things go wrong, that is a number worth knowing. But, and I want to make sure we give the fair picture, there is a case for tariffs, right? This isn't all one-sided.
There is absolutely a legitimate case, and it's worth understanding. The first argument is strategic. Some industries are genuinely too important to national security to allow complete dependence on foreign supply chains. Semiconductors, rare earth materials, pharmaceuticals. The COVID pandemic exposed how vulnerable single-source supply chains can be. A targeted tariff to rebuild domestic capacity in those sectors has genuine strategic logic.
The steel and aluminum argument.
The steel and aluminum argument. You don't want to discover in the middle of a war that you can't make enough tanks because all your steel comes from a country that's now your adversary. That's real. That's legitimate. The second argument is leverage. Tariffs as a negotiating tool. Use the threat of market access to extract concessions on other countries' trade barriers. The Trump administration did reach deals with the UK, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, the EU during the 90-day pause. Some of those deals involved genuine market opening for American exports.
So tariffs as a scalpel can make sense. The question is whether what we got was a scalpel or a sledgehammer.
The question is always whether it's a scalpel or a sledgehammer. A 10% blanket tariff on Lesotho, a tiny landlocked country in southern Africa with no real trade relationship with the U.S., is not strategic. It's collateral damage from a formula that didn't distinguish.
And who ultimately pays the collateral damage?
The American consumer, every time.
Okay, wealth moves. What does a real person actually do given all of this?
3 moves. And these build directly on what we've covered in earlier episodes.
Hit us.
Move 1. Your budget needs a tariff line item right now. The $600 household increase in 2026 doesn't arrive as one bill. It arrives as 30 cents more for groceries here, $4 more for a shirt there, higher car prices, more expensive electronics. It's invisible inflation. Go back to your monthly spending and add a buffer. If you're budgeting to the dollar and your cost of living has quietly risen, you're already behind.
Move 2.
Reframe your portfolio through a trade war lens. In every previous trade war episode, Smoot-Hawley, Reagan's steel tariffs, the 2018 Trump tariffs, the sectors that held up best were domestic-facing businesses with pricing power. Consumer staples, things people buy regardless of economic conditions. Healthcare, utilities, defense. These companies can pass cost increases through to consumers and aren't dependent on global supply chains the same way tech and discretionary retail are. We talked about XLP and XLV in episode 10 on stagflation. Those same defensive sector ETFs are relevant here.
And move 3?
Think carefully before making dramatic moves out of fear. Here is the history that actually matters for long-term investors. The The S&P 500 fell nearly 20% in 5 days after Liberation Day. Investors who panic sold in those 5 days locked in massive losses. The market recovered. It finished 2025 up 16% from where it started. Every trade war in history, including Smoot-Hawley, eventually ended. Countries negotiate, deals get made, courts intervene, supply chains reroute. The long-term investor who stayed invested through every one of those episodes came out ahead of the investor who tried to time the crisis.
Prepare without predicting.
Always.
Grant, close us out.
1,000 economists signed a petition in 1930 telling Herbert Hoover not to sign Smoot-Hawley. He signed it anyway. Global trade collapsed 65%. The Depression deepened. Both the congressmen who authored the bill, Smoot and Hawley, lost their seats in the 1932 election. The lesson was so painful, so clear, that both parties cited it for 90 years as a reason to be careful with tariffs. 1 year after Liberation Day, the legal system has pushed back. The bond market has pushed back. The economists are pushing back again. Whether this ends like Smoot-Hawley or like the 2018 trade war, a few deals, some pain, markets recover, is genuinely unknown. What is known is that the cost is falling on American households. $600 this year, $1,700 since it started. Real money from real budgets. And the people who understand that are the ones who can plan around it.
Liberation Day, 1 year later. The golden age is still pending. But Trek for Wealth is here to make sure your financial plan isn't. All sources in the show notes. Share this one, especially with anyone who thinks tariffs are something that happened to other countries. They're not.
We'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.
Keep trekking.